with several lawmakers before today's hearing. They will answer questions about privacy issues at Facebook. The company admitted Cambridge Analytica had access to information for about 87 million users without them knowing. Cambridge Analytica is a data firm based in London that had ties to the Trump campaign.
He said they were lied to by Cambridge Analytica. Well, you can't protect our privacy just on the basis of somebody telling you that they're going to protect it. So does that mean law? Does that mean regulation? Yes.
Congress released Zuckerberg's prepared testimony. In it, he says his company did not do enough to prevent these tools from being used for harm.
Joining us is David Kennedy, a former NSA hacker and CEO of Trusted SEC, an information security consulting company. Good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So was Facebook just careless? Were they naive? Or was it all just part of a plan to make more money?
Well, if you look at what Facebook's business model is, it's to sell personal information, and that's how they make their money. So when you go to Facebook and you put in personal information, where you're from, your personal preferences, what you shop for, all that data is sold to companies and used to be able to market, and targeted ads and other pieces of information. So when this was going on in 2013, maybe they didn't want to expose this much amount of data where they're able to actually, it was only sent to about 100,000 people, but what happened is it went to everybody's contacts, so it spread kind of like a worm across everywhere. So they're able to pull people's contact information, what their personal preferences were, and that's how you got to that multi-million person count number. And so they locked that down, but really, what we're looking at is Mark Zuckerberg's business is your information. That's how he's able to make money. That's how the company is able to make money. That's why it's a multi-billion-dollar organization. It's really based on selling personal information.
So is that model going to change going forward? Are they going to charge people to use it and not sell personal information?
I don't think so. It doesn't look like that. So what Mark Zuckerberg is saying is that they're going to take better precautions in trying to restrict the amount of access that certain developers may have, certain surveys may have, but it's not changing its business model around how it's able to sell its information to target ads against you or the type of information that it actually collects against you. Just 2 weeks ago, it was identified that if you use the Facebook Messenger app, if you're using Android, it would actually go and pull your contact information and pull all of the calls that you were doing. So there's a lot of information that Facebook is pulling and storing in order to really try to target ads against individuals, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon.
So the question is, how should we look at this? Facebook might say, hey, this is what we are. If you want to be a part of it, great, and it's a fun way to connect. But Congress may be looking at this and say, hey, this is the new way we communicate, and this is a bigger deal, and we need to control you. Which is the better way to look at this?
Well, what Mark is doing, and that's why he's taking a lot of the blame, is trying to get ahead of this so that there isn't regulations or restrictions put on the type of information they can do, because that would have a major impact on their business. What Congress is looking at is, hey, this is a massive exposure. It's not just this Cambridge Analytics. Remember that there's a lot of terrorist activity that's going on. Conservatives are saying that they're hindering ads that were going from the Conservative Party during the election cycle. But it's more than just the Cambridge Analytics problems that they're having with Facebook. It's the amount of power that Facebook has around personal information and how they're using it. So we may see a lot of discussion around what restrictions can they put in place in private companies and the type of information that they can collect in order to protect it. We don't know at this point, but it's going to be interesting to see how both these play out and what the middle spot is going to be.
Real quickly before we go, is there anything the average person can do except stay off of social media?
Well, we've already seen a movement called Delete Facebook, where Elon Musk deleted his SpaceX profile and Tesla profile. Steve Wozniak from Apple deleted their profile. A lot of folks are actually going and deleting their Facebook profiles based on the information and the protest, what's going on. What I recommend is going into your privacy settings, making sure that they're locked down so these developers can't have access to your information. You can actually lock them down in your settings profile and gives you granular permission, but they are open by default.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Here now to react is Michael Nunez, Mashable Deputy Tech Editor, Gary Kaltbaum from Kaltbaum Capital Management and a Fox News contributor, Heather Zumaraga, Vision 4 Vice President, and David Kennedy, Trusted Secretary, CEO. Good to see you all. Heather, let me go to you first. I thought that the exchange between Senator Blumenthal and Zuckerberg was really the one that got to the core of what it was that they did that shouldn't be done again, and whether it's possible for Facebook to correct this. Right after Zuckerberg had said, we don't sell data, he said, you, the user, control the information and data you put on Facebook. We saw the terms of service between Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. Senator Blumenthal had an assistant showing clearly that, in fact, that's exactly what they were doing with the data. Now, Zuckerberg didn't see that. I'm sure he doesn't see every contract that's signed between Facebook and the people that they deal with, but it showed that indeed they had sold or at least rented data to an outsider, and of course they sort of lost control of what that outsider did with that data. That seemed to hurt Zuckerberg's case.
Yes, and that's exactly why he's there today, because 87 million users' data was misused or sold to Cambridge Analytica through a third-party app that was given permission. We don't know if Cambridge Analytica actually had permission from the other side. I definitely don't remember giving them permission to use my data, but perhaps it was buried somewhere in one of the many privacy agreements on one of the many different pages, opt in or opt out. But that is why he's in this situation right now, and it doesn't look good for them. They violated our trust, and that's not right.
Michael, when I heard Zuckerberg say, you, the user, control the information and data that you put on Facebook, a direct quote from Zuckerberg, I found that to be a hard sell. You know the inside of how these social network sites work. Is that a tough sell? Is it true what he said?
Well, I think he's right that users opt into this service, right? They decide what they put on the platform, and by uploading those things, they basically opt into to Facebook's terms of agreement. I think what most of the public is lost on is what happens to that information once they submit it, and how innocuous details like the hotel that you're staying in one night, or maybe whether you prefer a certain type of food, or even like a certain baseball team, or very innocuous details about your life can actually be used to triangulate ideologies that you might prescribe to, or any of your political leanings. And so the type of
Senator Cruz, by the way, forgive me, but it was Senator Cruz that focused on that. Clearly there are cases where some stuff that reveals a liberal bias on the part of a lot of people who work for Facebook affected what goes on and what gets taken off of Facebook.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so Senator Cruz actually referenced a story that I had written in 2016, and I think what he got to the bottom of is that Facebook is actually much larger than someone like Mark Zuckerberg can even keep up with. So, some of the revelations that, that was part of the reporting that I've done was that Facebook is, in fact, moving fast and breaking.
There are too many pieces. He can't control it. I want to get to Gary because we don't have much time, but I'm wondering how all of this will affect Facebook's value. That is, we've seen the hit on the stock over the past couple of weeks, although it was up 4.5% today, but that doesn't make up for all that it's lost over the past couple of weeks. What will advertisers begin to pull out as a result of this? Will it affect the bottom line of the company?
I think the playing field does change, but I'm not sure by much. They've already said it really hasn't impacted how many people may or may not be leaving at this point in time. And look, as long as advertisers think they can make money because of it, and there's a ton of businesses that use Facebook, I think they'll be fine. But leave no doubt, if they don't change, somebody is going to change for them, as they have definitively abused the relationship between user and the company, and we're finding it out in spades at this point in time.
David, I'm sorry to do this. We have 30 seconds. You got to tell us, will Facebook's value diminish as a result of what we're seeing today?
I don't think so. I don't think there's a big surprise that Facebook uses this information. I think the sheer volume was the concern and how they're going and doing it. I think Mark did a good job of explaining that you can lock down a lot of the privacy settings, but at the same time, they do need to be more cautious around what they're doing. Some of the concerns around the call logs and what they're actually harvesting from an SMS and text messaging and a messenger perspective are pretty alarming. And we don't really have a lot of visibility into that. And I don't think those questions have been answered very well.
Terrific stuff, guys. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right, welcome back, everybody. The Dow at session highs right now, up about 165 points for now. And I always stress for now because we try not to get too obsessed in these cyclic movements, up or down. This seems to be about technology and what kind of a day it can have today. If some issues are scoring a comeback, or at least well off their lows, as appears to be the case right now, even though Amazon is its own separate soap opera here, the market will improve. If not, then the market goes back down. And a lot of this has to do with this prevailing wisdom that what ails Facebook and Tesla and Amazon and Netflix and all of those top names that were the names leading this market higher, anything that shows that they might have been overdone on the selling is taken as tonic, and people pounce in and buy at crucial levels or some inflection points, if you will, whatever. I don't always buy that kind of thing. I think it's too rapid conditions, but something's going on here. We're up about 205 points. It could also be the fact that interest rates unwinding a little bit from session lows, and we got down to about 2.75% on a 10-year note. That's backing up just a tad right now. Still very, very low and nowhere near the close to 3% it was at less than 2 weeks ago in the middle of that market downdraft. Very, very different environment today, but that environment, as I say, can change, and we can see volatility. For example, these 1% swings you hear so much about, a key definition of volatility is how much you go up or down. We have already had double the number of 1% swings in this market this year than we had all of last year. All right, the cybersecurity expert, Alex Hammerstone, on what Facebook is trying to assure users it is doing to protect its data or their data. And a lot of this has been done by way of telling them in one page what they used to tell them in more than 20 pages. Bottom line, what do you think they're up to, Alex? What are they proposing?
Well, so it looks like they're making it easier for users to understand what types of data they've authorized Facebook to have and how to use it as well. A little bit more control over, a little bit more granularity in how they're being able to share that data and see what's being shared.
All right, now, if they spell out what they're going to do on this, how can I believe or trust them? I've heard similar reports from other companies that vowed never to see, credit data released or getting in the wrong hands, and yet it happens a lot. So all the assurances in the world aren't going to make me trust the company again, or will they?
Absolutely. So that's a challenge that we see every day, and that even organizations that are working hard to keep the data secure, can lose control of that data. One of the things I think is important is that when you sign up for these services, you're signing these agreements, and we all sign them and don't necessarily read them and just kind of check the box that we agree. But if you really read those and look at the types of data that's out there being shared, it's really a copious amount. And that once your data goes out to somebody else, whether it's healthcare data or it's personal data or whatever it is, you really are relying on someone else to protect that data, and you have very little control over what they do with it.
All right, so if Facebook is telling me right now we're going to police this better, presumably they were policing it better, before word got out of this 50 million plus users who were seeing their information compromised and in political hands. So how can they guarantee that? Can they guarantee that? All the promises in the world is going to change that. I mean, the questions I'm asking are the same ones congressmen are going to be asking Mark Zuckerberg, right?
It would seem so, and I think one of the things is now that there's a lot more visibility into it from the public. Not to be cynical at all, but there might be a lot more calls for change in how this data is used. It is tough to get the assurances. It's tough to know where the data goes, especially in this case. With the issue that happened, it appears that the data was acquired as per Facebook's rules, and then from there was shared with other parties, and that's really difficult to control. Once you share your data legitimately as an organization, making sure that whomever you share that data with is protecting it per the contract can be a very large challenge.
I just get a feeling, and you're the expert, Alex, and the technical expert at that, but I just get a feeling that this is not over for Facebook, justified or not. There are a lot of other things that are probably going to come to light, and this is going to be like a full, cache cavity search here, and I don't know if it ends quickly.
It does seem a little bit like there's a lot more tension than we might see with some of these issues. Past issues like this have kind of come and been in the news for a bit and gone away. But I think really Facebook's become such a big part of everyone's life or so many people, and it just has so much information and reaches into so many parts of everyone's lives. This is going to be a little bit different, and the types of information that they have is a different type of thing because it's so personal. Gotcha. It's not like, your banking data, which is you don't want to lose, but it's different than a lot of the data Facebook may have.
All right, thank you, my friend. Alex Hammerstone following this very, very closely. A fellow who's going to have a front row seat at getting to the bottom of this is Louisiana Republican Senator John Kennedy. He's already sent a letter to Facebook asking about the company's relationship, for example, with Russian companies, many of them are very big chunks of Facebook. Senator, very good to have you.
Okay, thank you so much for joining. Give everyone a little blast of Alex there as we get started. My name is Stephen Marshowitz. Thank you again for joining Trusted Sec's webinar on Facebook's data scandal and GDPR, how it impacts you. Wanted to just get things started. Obviously, GDPR has been a hot topic lately. And then just so happened that we had the Facebook scandal and Mark Zuckerberg presenting to Congress on his booster seat. So we really looked at, well, how is this going to impact not only them, of course, but how does it impact the rest of the world and our organizations as well. So let me tell you a little bit about Trusted Sec. We've been in business for about 6 years now. We regularly speak at conferences and on the news, as you just saw with Alex. We really, try to bring in top talent on your behalf. So we're always giving you the best information, the latest and greatest on what hacking is doing, and also what advisory and what you need to do from a risk perspective. So what we do and why we're a little bit different is we start with really the most challenging aspect of security, and that's understanding the real-world effectiveness of your security controls against active human skilled attackers with unlimited time using cutting-edge research and techniques. So a little bit different. The world has changed quite a bit recently. So we're the leading attack intelligence company in the world. We've created the de facto standards and tools in security such as the penetration testing execution standard, the social engineering toolkit, various GitHub security repositories. So if you haven't checked those out, hit our website, and there's a lot of great tools and information and things being used all over the world. We also run DerbyCon, the second largest hacking conference in the U.S., seventh largest in the world. And through our industry-leading research team, we're able to use those tools that the other companies try and work with. Metasploit is, again, another one that we've contributed to and written a book on. So it's critical that we start there because the better the penetration testing, the better information you have to understand the real world, again, effectiveness of your defenses. So when you align that information with the risks to the business based on your critical systems, the threats from adversaries, your program maturity and architecture, the advisory and technical teams are able to provide more value than just about anyone else to help build your security posture in the most cost-effective way. So some of our services, just to give you an overview, I'll pick out a few of them that have been gaining a lot of steam. And again, especially as the world's changed in the last couple of years, people are moving, toward, I would say away from penetration testing and more towards the more valuable aspects of a red team, where we are actually doing adversarial attack simulation, and then a purple teaming. That combination of the attack team and the defense team coming together and working together so that we can understand and help you respond to incidents for both how are you detecting them, what kind of measures are you using, what did you see, what did you not see. So really getting some great traction there, and as your organization matures, something you might want to look at or ask about versus just a standard penetration test. And then on the advisory side, obviously we have quite a bit in the regulatory assistance, which we'll be talking about today, GDPR, of course, do a tremendous amount of reports on compliance for PCI. And within the organization, we're helping organizations build their security programs with our virtual CISO and our security program building. So that has, because again, we always say no one person knows all there is to know about security compliance. We look to help you to bridge that gap and build up your program, but you don't always need every piece of expertise. You might need just a few. So a little bit on that. So let me, without further ado, let me introduce Alex. Alex Hammerstone, as you saw from the video, speaks regularly in news circles and does speaking engagements. He's our GRC, Governance, Risk, and Compliance Practice Lead here. He's had over a decade plus of experience. I've known him for more than a decade now. He's really, when he gets on engagements, those customers are exceptionally excited to have him. He provides a lot of value to them. He's a former QSA, has CISP, ISO, all the good things, and really helps us within Trusted Sec and helps our customers integrate, as I was talking about earlier, all the different aspects of security into the posture. So with that, let me turn it over to Alex, and you can walk through what you can talk about today.
Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate that very much. Just a bit to touch on my experience, I just want to make it very clear that, one of the strengths that we bring is that we see so many different environments. And, there was a given month in the last year where, I worked with a client that was a sole proprietorship. The one person writes the code, markets the code, takes out the trash, does everything, all the way up to work with the largest companies on earth. So we see a very wide swath of the industry and see how people are managing security programs, how they're implementing controls, et cetera. They have a pretty good idea of what works and what doesn't. As far as this presentation goes today, obviously this is a very large issue, and we can't touch on everything, but the idea is to kind of get a view of it. Kind of getting two reactions or two general feelings out of clients that we talk to. One is kind of kind of no big deal, we'll see what happens. The other one is kind of a complete freak out. And the answer is probably somewhere in between. When you talk about other standards like a PCI or a HIPAA or things like that, we have a lot of history with them. So we have a pretty good idea of what happens with non-compliance, how often that happens, what the penalties are, et cetera. But with this being new, obviously, we don't necessarily have that yet. And so there are a lot of questions that are coming are things that, kind of will be seen. Also very important to note that, your compliance stature and whether this applies to you is a legal issue. So I want to make sure that we, involve counsel and that type of thing, and making sure that we're doing the right thing. So even if, we may have commentary about the controls, et cetera, it's, legal issues and legal questions there as well. One of the things that we're seeing in the environment and overall is a lot more privacy. So we operate in the security space, do a lot of very technical things, but more and more is hearing about privacy. And it is different than security from a practice standpoint, but they are very, very closely aligned. Security is obviously the ability to protect your information, your relational resources, et cetera, with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the triad that we hear about a lot. With privacy is a little bit different, but it's the protecting and proper use of people's personal information. Now, when you look into the GDPR, it's pretty broad as far as what personal data covers. Everything from name, an internal ID number that can be associated with somebody, location data, physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, all these different data markers. So it's very, very broad as far as what we're collecting. And kind of as a side note, one of the things that we always kind of debate internally or talk about is how granular does this get? So when you think about location data, like let's say that that somebody's car is parked outside of a healthcare office that provides one specific type of service, and it's there every week, what can you infer from that? So how far down the road you go as far as the granularity and not just the actual data that you have, but what can be inferred from that data as well. So, GDPR, obviously, we're hearing about it all the time. Some people are surprised to remember that the adoption date was in April of 2016. So this isn't new. I think that it can be kind of a challenge, whether it's, trying to get a project done or anything like that. When you have a lot of time to do it, it can be very easy to, kind of kick the can down a little bit and think you're going to worry about it later. But now here we are, all of a sudden it's coming. A little over a month ago. And, I think we're still hearing a lot of people that aren't necessarily ready or don't know what's coming. And a lot of that remains to be seen. As you can see, the enforcement date or the implementation is going to be May 25th. So not too far away. Although we'll have a nice long weekend in the U.S. at least to recover from any of that. So now one thing that we are seeing, and you'll see this is from one of the Gartner reports, is that privacy is really driving security spending. Whenever there's a breach or a thing like that's in the news, or if a company has a breach, oftentimes that will drive a lot of security spending. A lot of the news stories drive a lot of security concern. We do a lot of board presentations, and it's kind of interesting. So if I'm flying out to talk to the board of a company and there's been a big story about a breach in the news, that's going to be something that they're going to ask about. Even if from a probability standpoint that is unlikely, that the exact methodology of the current breach in the news. But privacy more and more, and it's really driving spending. And when you think about the way the world's changed and how much data is aggregated and kept and stored and used in various ways and shared, It's the privacy of that data is starting to really, really drive these spends. One of the most interesting things is, I have this report that we see from eMarketer is just the amount of ad data or amount of the ad market that is concentrated in Google and Facebook. And so it's one of the things that made that such a big story with Facebook because they have so much data. But if you look at this, more and more this is starting to be distributed out. And so more and more companies are starting to have additional data and collect this additional data. And if GDPR is going to apply to you, it's definitely going to be something that's going to come up and it's going to be a concern. So making sure that we kind of understand what a data subject is. It's an identifiable natural person. And if you look through the articles of GDPR, it's just quite extensive. You'll see that term used very often. But it's somebody that's identifiable, so a person, and the personal data relating to them. So it's very important that you're very clear on what the data subject rights are and are able to demonstrate that. So things like breach notification. So if there is a breach, and obviously making sure that you have a plan to define what that is, what a breach is, because that's a specific legal term, one of those terms that we use it very often outside of a legal context in the industry, but it does have a very specific legal definition. So it's making sure that we're notifying the data subjects in the event of a breach. Ensuring the right to access your data. So if you think about, where do you have all your data? Is it stores that you purchase things from? Is it social media? Is it email providers? Your data is out there. Companies have it. And so at this point, people are going to be able to, request that and access their data. One of the more challenging ones is, of course, the right to be forgotten. So let's say that you want to, you have a bad experience, you want to quit Facebook, you want to quit your email provider, or whatever it is. They will tend to have copious amounts of information on you that they need to delete. Now, that's one thing for a large company with defined processes. But when you think about smaller or mid-sized companies, oftentimes things like what's in your backups, what other areas, when you think about how easy it is to create data, it really is as simple as a Control-C and a Control-V if you're on Windows, if you're on a Mac, to create additional data. So all of a sudden you had all your data mapped, you knew where it was, and now you just doubled in size. Portability, so things like if you are unhappy with the service and want to switch, that you can take that data with you. Privacy by design is a big one. We always talk about if you were to start a new company and were to be able to build it from the ground up, you could build in security processes, privacy processes. We all know that's kind of not how companies are built. They tend to be either, they grow organically or they grow through acquisitions, and that, you don't have the privacy or the security program of a multi-million-dollar or a billion-dollar company when you start. So making sure that you kind of go back and bolt on these privacy measures and just show that your program is designed to provide a reasonable level of privacy. Another important point is having a data protection officer or a DPO. We get asked very often if that could be outsourced, and the answer that we're hearing is yes. But it must be a demonstrable expert. So, it could be things like CISSP or a CISA certification. It's very important that that person, whether they are internal or they are a third party, is completely independent, so that they're not able to be influenced. So, if they have a certain concern that may affect revenue or something else, that they, won't be kind of pushed aside. Another important thing to note is that when we look at HIPAA, or something like that, people are usually familiar with that one, is that a person, the HIPAA privacy officer, is often accountable and legally and in other ways as well as the organization. But in this case, the organization is accountable. Another thing to keep in mind is that the DPO must have full access to the organization. That means that they're able to walk around, talk to whoever they want to, access whatever the data they need, and really be able to make a really good assessment. So looking at the 5 core areas, the things that we really want to address, with GDPR. So one is the data flow and inventory. Now, this is something that organizations should really be doing anyway. This shouldn't necessarily just be in response to the GDPR. And then it's knowing what you have and where it is. And if you think about it, that's really a fundamental part of security. If you think about a bank, they don't build a vault around the whole building, they build a vault around the money. And so that, just making sure that you understand what you have, where it is, and that, and make sure the inventory. Even if you look at, kind of the CSC top 20, the top 2 are, around inventory. So these are all core security concepts. But it's, I'm not really surprised by anything I see anymore. But oftentimes, just, organizations not understanding where their data is and how it's moving around. So who has access to it? Is it leaving your organization? Is it going to third parties? Is it leaving your building? And who has access internally? So data protection impact assessment, another core element. So again, just really understanding what you have as far as data goes. Understand that full scope. So what are you storing and how is it stored? Is it on your internal IT systems? Is it on backups? Is it accessible to anyone with the organization, or is there tight access control? Do you know when it's been copied, et cetera? Managing that data. So establishing your data governance program. Governance is a word that we hear all the time, but as security programs and the security industry matures, it's becoming more and more essential. Making sure that we have defined and have appropriate support behind these initiatives. So it's not just something that's put in place. It is something that's supported by executives, et cetera. Making sure that the people in the organization accept their responsibility or are educated about it. It's very common that people don't necessarily understand what data they have or that they've what they've agreed to. When you think about when you hand somebody a company handbook, the number of times that a new hire gets a company handbook that's 200 pages and hands it back 5 minutes later is reading and accepting the whole thing is pretty common. But in this case, really making sure that people understand what they need to do and understand what their responsibilities are. And making sure that you empower people. We talk about empower as kind of a buzzword, but it's true. So making sure that people are able to speak up and make decisions and assign responsibilities appropriately. The protection. So how are you protecting your data? So understand the organization, how it's using data, how those flows work, how's it protected at rest, how's it protected in motion, et cetera. And then the reporting. So, it's just making sure that we are able to go in and audit and see what we're doing and if we're following our own rules and doing the right things. Tracking where the data is, et cetera. Risk assessment is essential. Again, we commonly get asked about certain controls or how to do certain things. And the issue is that without a risk assessment, it's very difficult to know what to do. If you don't know where your most important data is, it's impossible to know how to, go ahead and protect that data appropriately and make sure that you're providing the right protection. There's multiple methodologies used for risk assessments. A lot of organizations have their own internal ways of doing it. And there are also risk assessment methodologies from NIST and from other organizations. ISO has some that are, created by the best minds in the business in a lot of cases, and really, good ways to do that. But really, just making sure that you're performing that full risk assessment, and it feeds from that inventory and understanding the data that you have and where it is and what you're doing with it. Additionally, this is another standard and another thing kind of like ISO and some of the others that are very heavily documentation focused. So if you are, involved in a situation where your compliance is being questioned or checked, is making sure that you have these things documented. So what are your policies? What are your procedures and processes around protecting this data? There's generally, if we look at any standard or any security program, it's certain best practice documentation. From an overarching security policy, acceptable use, patching, passwords, third-party management, incident response. Record retention is extremely important in this context. And then the other one is obviously breach preparation. So that's not something that we want to have happen, but if in the case that it does, is be prepared, having the plan. Making sure that your third parties are involved in it, making sure that the marketing team is involved in it, making sure that you have notification methodologies, making sure that you're covering all these requirements is essential. One thing that we hear a lot about, especially now, and we talk through, is the customer experience. So one thing that will definitely change a bit is how you're notifying customers or notifying them of your responsibilities and your security program and how you're managing their data. Consumers must opt in, to how you're using these things and things like your privacy agreements. Are you using cookies? Are you tracking their location? How are you communicating with them? How are you analyzing this data? And how are you using this personal information? It's oftentimes used for advertising. If you look at a lot of some of the biggest tech companies, they make their revenue off advertising. They make revenue off selling data. So how are you using that data? Additionally, you're probably going to see more pop-ups. We're used to kind of just clicking a end user licensing agreement or some kind of consent form without reading it or thinking about it. But these will likely be kind of more in your face. It's definitely going to be a change for a lot of organizations, and providing these abilities, for your customers to be able to, make decisions or have information around the data that they have or that you have and how you're using it. It definitely remains to be seen, how many of these complaints are going to be, but it's definitely coming. So from that overview, what we'd like to do is open things up for questions and kind of be able to cover some of the topics that way.
So the first question we have is on frameworks. Would the CIS Top 20 be a good framework, or NIST is more US-based, but is there a particular one that makes more sense? What is it?
So one of the things, Steve, is that if you look at these frameworks, and the Cloud Security Alliance has like a really good mapping of multiple frameworks and how they cover each other, is that they tend to cover a lot of the same things. And those core things that those frameworks cover are obviously things that are, would be good ideas to have. As far as if you're operating, internationally, ISO can be a great standard. It's very documentation heavy. I know that there's, a lot of issues with nonconformities that may not be as related to security issues, but more related to documentation issues and things like that. But really, any of these frameworks, are a good way to put in place a program and just really build your security program based on best practices and things that have been agreed upon and developed by security professionals.
And then what about going back to Facebook and Google? Where are they going to start, or what's the differences between what the EU is doing with them, or is there a difference between what the EU is doing with them versus what they would do with our company or smaller company?
So, Steve, that's a really great question, and it's something that we've been kind of talking about and debating both internally, externally with others in the industry, as well as, fielding questions from clients. And again, going back to what we discussed earlier, is that with these other standards, there's a lot of history. And obviously, it's a lot of history is a relative term. But that we have some idea, if you talk about PCI or HIPAA or these other things, what happens if you're non-compliant and there's an issue? And that we're able to see and kind of, have an idea what the fines are going to be, have an idea of, who's getting hit and that kind of thing, and how the enforcement works. With this, again, there's not a lot of history. But again, it was interesting because we were actually talking to an expert today, and they used one of the same analogies that we use quite often, which is kind of a speed limit. And so, if the speed limit is 55 and you're driving 60, you're probably in better shape than somebody driving 95, and that's usually where the enforcement will go first. It'll take a long time, or it takes some time for regulators to build a case, against an organization, as well as the fact that, these larger ones obviously, have more data and have more ability to pay these fines and that. Now, one thing is obviously when there are individual complaints, et cetera, that may additionally lead to additional enforcement action.
So how do we in the USA balance our right to privacy? So obviously we're not in the EU, and versus our right to innovate and communicate with organizations, and a lot of times when we collect data, that's going to be very valuable for the organizations. How would you say in the U.S. that we would balance that?
So again, the U.S. and the EU are obviously a little bit different as far as privacy concerns go. The right to innovate does not, generally supersede the right of people to have privacy or comfort in that way. if you think about, the right to innovate doesn't, if you're, in the car business, the right to innovate doesn't allow you to endanger pedestrians. And so kind of the same thought process is that, yes, you can innovate, but you have to do it maybe in a more kind of a pullback manner so that, you're not just using the data in ways that are inappropriate. This has been coming for a long time as far as data goes. I think that if you think about conversations, when you first had those shopper cards used in the supermarket, from there people could, the stores could see what you were buying, what you were doing, when you were shopping, your preferences, and we're collecting that data. And then it's just really just been supercharged, in the past decade with the amount of data. And one of the most interesting things is that over time, it used to be that if you had all this data, you couldn't do much with it because there was just too much, and trying to make connections and make, second, third, fourth layer connections between people and their purchasing habits and all that. But now there's just so much processing power available that we're able to make all these connections with data, and it's just the data is everywhere, and there's so much information about everybody out there.
So then what happens on the deadline in your estimation, I guess?
It's going to be interesting to see, I would imagine that, and this is just pure speculation based on, talking to other people in the industry, that there probably are, regulators or lawsuits lined up against some of the larger organizations, and that people may be kind of lying in wait for that to happen. The other thing we kind of talked about was, you see all these campaigns on social media to boycott companies or go after companies. And, could there be almost like a virtual DDoS attack of, getting a group together, getting thousands of people together that want to protest a company to go out and request their data or request documents and flood them with requests to kind of bring the organization to their knees. So, that's a possibility. But I think it really does, I hate to say it because I like to, in our industry, I like to be able to give, some guidance. But we just haven't seen it yet. We just don't know what's going to happen. And I think one of the things that we've talked about with some of our partners and friends in Europe, and one thing that they've seen is with this on the horizon, there's been a huge drain of people with knowledge of this of security from the public sector into private organizations. And so that, anecdotally, one of the things that you're hearing is that some of the regulating bodies or those are, have less of the people with the experience as we go forward. So it's just, I think it's going to be a very interesting time. It's an interesting time to be in the industry, and it's definitely going to continue to change.
And then, question for me. You've seen a lot of maturity assessment, program maturity, seen, organizations, large and small, with just general maturity. General maturity. How long do you think it would take them if they haven't started yet? If they only do a little bit in the EU? Again, just taking the average or the median maturity level of most of the organizations that you've seen over the last 5 years or so.
That's a tough one, Stephen. I think definitely just given the broad range of organizations that we see, and that some organizations that you might not expect to have very strong and robust security and privacy programs do, and some organizations that a lot of people would be surprised to hear that maybe they're not as mature as you thought. And not speaking about any of our clients, but just if you look in the news and you see these very large organizations with very large security budgets and huge revenues, and then you see when it comes out how they were breached, and it's pretty obvious that the types of things that allowed them to be breached, were indicative of not having a very mature security program. It can be surprising. There are certain retailers that, when there's a breach, you're surprised that someone of that size would not have a more mature security program. So, to answer your question, it really depends because, if you're already doing the things that are going to give you a pretty mature security program and privacy program, you're going to be in much better shape than if you're not doing anything. And maybe this will be kind of spur some organizations to get moving on these things. I know that, not to keep going back to PCI, but it's something that, we have history with and you've seen it, is that you do see a lot of organizations that may not do a whole lot around security, but they have to because of that. Or in certain regulated environments, there's certain parts of those businesses that are going to be much more, their programs will be much more mature and intact than maybe others that don't have requirements.
questions for executives. Could you go back to that slide and just expand on it a little bit? A few back there, I guess. And just talk about so back to that, maturity, but back to that question of how are executives embracing this, or how do you think they will, and then what types of things do you think they'll be asking of, again, a data privacy officer?
That's really a great question.
Which is probably going to be an IT person, right? I mean, a data privacy officer, they're going to say, all right, the IT person, or if they haven't, probably most organizations outside of healthcare wouldn't have typically data privacy officer or just a privacy officer.
Well, I've got to guess a lot of organizations are going to have one appointed pretty soon, and it's going to be something that is filled in. But definitely, and kind of down in the back a little bit is, one of the things that in the security industry or the privacy industry, one of the things that we're charged with, and one of the things that we need to make sure that we're doing is providing the correct information to executives to make decisions, whether those are risk decisions or other program decisions. We always say kind of operations operates, and that's what they do, and they're out there to build a business and move people along and make money. And sometimes security or privacy can be seen as a party of no. And so, in this case, looking for ways to enable the business to operate and still generate revenue and conduct business, in a way that is most secure. But so when executives are looking for answers on these things, it's looking at what data is impacted by this. So do you have data of EU citizens? And, I was at a presentation a month or so ago, and one of the questions that came up is, if you're a U.S. hospital and you only operate in the U.S., have nothing outside the U.S., and an EU citizen, has an emergency and you treat them and have their data, are you subject to, GDPR requirements? And I asked somebody that works at, that's an expert on this over in Europe, and said, well, technically, yes. But you have to think, is that something that the EU is going to go after? Are they going to go after one record of somebody that needed emergency care? And you can answer that for yourself, and think about that. Or are they going to go after the larger companies that are collecting data and using it in different ways? But really, it's just understanding, what is this data? And there may even be some companies that have to make a decision, is it worth, having EU customers if it's a small number, if it's going to require a lot of changes to processes, procedures, and programs. Is it going to make sense to, have a European presence, or does it make sense to have European employees or that type of thing? If it's a small number, I think we've heard some people, ask those questions. But understand this data and are they EU citizens? And what are you doing with that data? If there is a breach, how can it harm an individual? That's kind of a bit of a nebulous question in some ways. When you think about it, if you look at what constitutes the data in this case, there are things that, a lot of can be, found in a phone book. So, I always joke that at some point I won't have a job because all the data will have already been compromised and there'll be nothing left to protect. And, but most people, when there's a breach, you get another, letter saying that you're going to get free credit monitoring. And, a lot of people have a ton of credit monitoring accounts at this point. But it's, really just understanding that, what is this data and are they in Europe and how's it going to harm them? Being able to go back and determine how a breach happened and being able to, put in place corrective actions so it doesn't happen again. Proper notification. So how is the marketing department or how is the crisis communication team and whatever that is going to notify people who are subject or who are part of this breach? And, how will, the GDPR, how is it going to impact marketing messages? How's it going to change things? How's it going to change how we sell to EU citizens or collect their data? Who in the organization is accountable? We always say if everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. So is there a specific person? Is there a specific department? Is there a specific role that's going to be accountable for ensuring that we are meeting these requirements? Or, we talk about sometimes too is, if you choose to be non-compliant, if you make a business decision to be non-compliant and kind of see what comes, have you made that decision at the right levels, and are you taking that risk appropriately? Because, with the fines, with the 4% or the 20 million, whichever higher, can definitely put a dent in a business. and really just, as we discussed first, is, do we even want to continue to expand, into Europe in this case if we're going to be having that kind of data?
So going back to then the DPO, are they, again, if they're going to be an IT person, how much legal impact is there? Is legal, have you seen legal get involved more, or what's the, should we be more proactive in that? Or?
So I am a very big proponent of involving legal departments and counsel in risk and program decisions. And the reason is because the organization is ultimately accountable. And, as a security professional, we can certainly comment on controls and sometimes their efficacy. But really, as far as whether, you're going to do certain things, a lot of times it does come down to a legal or executive risk decision. When we go out and we can field questions from clients about how this is going to apply, it oftentimes are things that are coming from counsel, and they are getting more and more involved. Because again, how to comply from a controls perspective or from a technical perspective, might be a technical function or it might be a marketing function or that. But when it comes to whether it applies and in what area it applies, it's very much something that we would recommend that counsel be involved in.
And then what about new technology? So there's a lot of rapid changes, probably most of it's hype versus, actually happening now, but the Internet of Things or blockchain, do you see that impacting things, or where do you see just sort of, heading off future problems, things to think about in case, for example, business executive says, hey, we need to get going in Internet of Things, or we need to open up our plant so that third parties can manage our machines.
Well, I think with blockchain, there's just keep in mind that there's kind of two ways people use that term. One is obviously the technical, way it's used, but then people are also oftentimes use that just for having distributed authentication and data. So in those cases, if you are using technology like that and using external sources to store and validate data, that could be definitely a concern. The IoT is another term that's bandied about quite a bit, and understanding, which element. So, and does that constitute data? So if you have, say, a refrigerator, and what's in it because the machine knows what's in it, is that personal data? Is somebody's diet, or, because you might be able to see that they have insulin in their refrigerator or something like that. Obviously, when you talk about the granularity of data, and we talked a little bit earlier about inference and what you can infer from certain bits of data about somebody or their personal, habits and that type of thing. Cloud is something additionally that, is a term I always joke that it's kind of a nebulous concept, and I usually write into presentations, allow for some laughter after that, but it's probably ambitious. But the truth is that, cloud has many definitions, and, but at the end of the day, it's really just, somebody else's computer. And so it depends on, how the cloud is implemented. Are you using someone else for storage? Are you using them for physical hosting? Is it just your equipment sitting somewhere and no one else can get to it, and you have a pipe right to it, et cetera. So really it's making sure that, whatever you have in the quote unquote cloud is protected at the same degree as things that are not. There are also regional concerns. So if you're talking about where the data sits, that becomes very important to make sure that you're managing your third parties and assessing contracts appropriately. You won't be the first company that has questions about GDPR and services like AWS or Azure, and making sure that you know how that data is being stored. You're making sure that they're compliant, they're able to remove data as necessary, et cetera. But really, it comes down to knowing where your data is again and what's being done with it and where it sits.
Okay. Any further questions? That might be about it. That's all I have gotten so far. Anything else? All right. We want to thank everyone for joining today, and thank you, Alex, very much for walking through it. Just a reminder for everyone that we will have our next webinar on business risk and business risk assessments on May 23rd, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to talking to you soon.